Hello students, Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to Developmental Psychology. So hopefully you've been following the class and reading chapter 1. So we're going to get into our first official lecture with chapter 1, okay? So I'm going to warn you guys, chapter 1, unfortunately, is one of our driest chapters, and I'm going to apologize for that. It's not the most exciting stuff, and yet it is one of the most important chapters of the entire course because it's basically laying down the foundation for the entire class. So, as a student, you want to go in with that kind of mindset that, hey, it's not the most exciting stuff, but at the same time, it's probably the most important chapter. So we're going to kick it off here and look at our slides and share my slides here. And we're going to start off with chapter 1. So if you've been reading chapter 1, you probably understand by now that developmental psychology or lifespan psychology is how we change over time. Those changes include many different things, including physical changes such as brain development, psychological changes. That could be an example that would be like intelligence, how our intelligence changes over time as we get older, and then even social changes. So our relationships would be a classic example of that. All right, so we're going to kind of move forward in the chapter here. And the next bit I want to go to is, why do we even bother studying lifespan development? Why do I have to take this class? I know many of you are probably a nursing student or going into teaching. Why in the world do I have to take this class? Why is it so important to know? So we're going to attempt to answer those questions in many different ways. So why do we bother studying lifespan development? Well, there are several reasons. Number one, by studying lifespan development, it helps us identify connections between earlier and later events. It's pretty self-explanatory, but in other words, through studying development, we've identified things that may happen when we're a child and how those are connected to later in life, maybe in adolescence or even adulthood. So for example, through studies, we've determined that exposure to lead as a child, they used to put lead in paint and things like that, and even child toys, believe it or not, we have discovered that exposure to lead early on can lead to mental deficiencies later down the road. So in other words, obviously it's important to understand these connections to improve our life, to find things that lead to bad consequences or even good consequences, depending on the case. So by studying lifespan development, it allows us to make those connections. Studying lifespan development also allows us to offer an organized account of development across the lifespan. What they're trying to say here is that it makes it easier to study. If we make it somewhat systematic and organized in nature, it allows us to study it in an easier way. So by studying development and setting it up in a certain way, it just makes it easier to digest and to understand as a human. Studying lifespan development allows us to account for the mechanisms responsible for lifespan development. So wow, it's a lot of fancy jargon there. But what that basically means is it helps us to identify things that we know are important to the developmental course. Examples of this would be poverty. For example, we know that poverty, living in poverty, can have a huge effect on our developmental course. Exposure to drugs and alcohol would be another example. Exposure to violence. So in other words, by studying this stuff, we've come to understand that certain areas, and there's a lot of them, seem to be important to development and can change our developmental course. So it's important to be aware of those. So obviously we can avoid them or expose children to more positive things, as an example. So it's important to kind of keep track of those different things. Studying development allows us to specify biological, psychological, and environmental factors that shape development. So remember, development, when we define it, it consists of how we change in accordance to all of these different areas. So we said biology, an example of that could be like your genetic makeup. where psychological factors could be a vulnerability to stress or anxiety and depression, as an example. Environmental factors, well, that could be maybe your parents divorced or you grew up in a certain neighborhood, that kind of thing. We know that all three of those different areas, biology, psychology, and environmental factors, are important because they influence the course of development. Well, knowing that all of these are important, we also know that they interact in certain ways. And this is where the class gets a little complex. So here's a huge moment in the class for you. We call these biopsychosocial interactions. In other words, those three areas that we just mentioned seem to interact in different ways and produce different outcomes. So the point is, by studying development, we can be aware of what combinations of what lead to detrimental effects, or combinations of these factors lead to positive effects. The point is that once these factors are identified and the combinations of these factors, we can help people to live their lives as positively as possible and to avoid negative outcomes. In other words, it allows us to enhance our lifespan development or even expand it to get us to live longer, as an example. So this is going to be a very common theme of the class because we know that certain combinations are recipes for disaster. So for example, let's say you had a genetic predisposition to anxiety, and your psychological makeup is that you have an anxiety disorder or you're depressed. And let's say that you grow up in an environmental factor where your parents are divorced and it's an abusive situation. In other words, that particular combination is probably a recipe for disaster. So the point is that by studying this and being aware of that, we can educate people as psychologists, developmental psychologists, to provide interventions to get them the help that they need and access to resources to prevent some of these consequences that we can possibly predict based on what the research shows. So it's all just kind of showing that it's important. All three of these areas are important, but how they interact is also another big factor that we would look at in a class like this. Okay, moving on. We know that humans are living longer than ever before. In other words, when we compare the average lifespan of humans across history, we have found that people, are living longer and longer. So the point is by studying development, we can understand why. What is it that is contributing to allow us to expand the lifespan? So I want to show you some data here. This is always kind of interesting. So somehow they've been able to calculate the average human life expectancy throughout history. In other words, how long people lived on average through different historical periods. Let's take a look here. So they have data going back to prehistoric times, and they found that the average person only lived to about 18. Remember, that's an average. So in other words, all of us, including myself, obviously, would be long gone by this point if we were living in that time. So it's interesting how people passed away so quickly back in history. If we look at ancient Greece, they've estimated to be about 20. Middle Ages, 33. Now notice it's expanding. 1620, Massachusetts Bay Colony, kind of the beginnings of our country in a sense, 35. 19th century England, 41. 1900 in the United States, 47. And then 1915, it jumps to 54. So really, just to kind of make a point, why we need to study development, they've discovered that, advances in medicine and nutrition, and more importantly, vaccines, contributed to some of these jumps in age. So in other words, by studying this stuff, we've discovered that avoiding certain diseases and taking preventative measures allowed humans to live longer. 1954 US, it was 70. So you can see that this trend is getting longer and longer in terms of the lifespan. 1992, 75. And so just to kind of make a long story short, Uh, if we look at data from 2016, and obviously this data is consistently changing, so it will be updated frequently, but as of 2016, the average human lifespan is 79. And that is in the United States, by the way. So 79. So we've gone from 18 all the way to 79. So once again, just to wrap that up, the point is that by researching developmental factors, we've discovered things that contribute to these longer lifespans. For example, better nutrition, better medicine, avoiding drugs and alcohol as an example. And obviously throughout history, they had some questionable practices that jeopardize the lifespan length. So once again, through studying this stuff, we've discovered certain factors that seem to be important to that. By the way, they've also estimated that babies born in our current generation, so babies that are born today, and this is the past few years, they expect them to live to 100 on average, which is just mind-blowing to think on average people would live to 100 based on our advances in medicine and so forth. Okay, so I thought that was interesting. All right, we're going to move on. And next we go to the important considerations of lifespan development. So here's another really important section for you guys to set the class up. These are different things I want you to keep in mind as we go throughout the course. Number one, changes occur over the entire lifespan. See, a lot of people kind of get locked into this mentality that we only change in childhood, and once we hit adulthood, things stabilize. It is actually quite different. For example, if we look at intelligence, it's one of the things we examine in this class, we know that certain types of intelligence can increase when we're younger, but as we get older, it may decrease. And not only that, we know that certain types of intelligence change over time. So they could increase, they could decrease, depending on what type of intelligence we're looking at. We see all different types of changes. So thus, we know that change isn't just in childhood, it's throughout our entire lifespan. And we're going to look at each stage one at a time as the course unfolds to examine some of those changes. And some of them are quite surprising. Secondly, development is not explained by age alone. A lot of people use these ages. Okay, you're 16, you're supposed to be this way. This is, how we explain your development. There are a lot of psychologists that believe age really only tells us about biological maturity and little else. In other words, we know that age is important. It's an important thing, but it certainly does not tell us everything about development. Okay, so I just want you to avoid that sort of mindset that age explains everything. It does not. There are several underlying causal factors that can make a 16-year-old person look very differently if we compare them. And we're going to look at some of those factors as we go. So don't get locked into age as everything. Development is definitely multi-directional. We've kind of already made this point, but what that means is that development can be explained by gains and losses. In other words, it's a two-way street. We're not always changing in one direction. It certainly could reverse itself. For example, we know that certain types of memory can improve, but can also be lost later in life. Height would be a great example of this. A lot of people only think that we grow in childhood. We're getting taller and taller and taller, and then we stop once we hit adulthood. It turns out that at certain points in our life, we actually lose a little bit of height. In fact, around 25, 26, some of our older students may relate to this. You actually lose a little bit of your height. And then as we get older, as we lose bone density, for example, we even shrink even more. So the point is, what we mean by multi-directional is that there are gains and losses. It's important to kind of understand that. It's not always in one direction. Certainly, development involves life choices, whether we choose to participate in drug use, what we choose to eat, choosing to be a smoker or not, how we choose to cope with stress. We know that all of those factors seem to be really important in how we develop as a human. So it's important to kind of look at those things as we go through the course and to examine those. So in other words, development is very influenced by personal choices and selections that we make. Next, we go to this term plasticity. And so what we're saying here is that development involves what we call plasticity. What that means is that we have the potential to change throughout life. We're kind of like a piece of plastic. We bend, we're molded, we're constantly changing. We're not this piece of stone that is set forever. So in other words, a lot of the factors that we talked about, for example, having positive experiences, exposure to negative experiences, for example, we know that those can change us as a person. So certainly we change throughout the entire lifespan. As we said before, it definitely involves this concept of plasticity to explain that we could basically change at almost any time. Okay, so think about that as we go through the course. All right, finally, development is influenced by sociocultural conditions in which you are exposed to or live in. In other words, we know that where you live and what you're exposed to seems to be important. In this case, sociocultural conditions. So for example, what culture were you raised in? What historical era did you grow up in? We see differences between different historical periods, which is obvious. What support services are available in your community? So maybe you live in a community that has lots of access to healthcare and preventative measures, for example, where other people may live in areas where they don't have that, like in third world countries, as an example. So we know that historical or sociocultural conditions, more specifically, seem to be very important to our developmental course. All right? So as we go throughout the class, guys, make sure you're thinking about these things. We're going to revisit these consistently throughout the course. All right? As always, if you have questions, you can always email me. I'd be happy to answer your questions. So I'm going to say will conclude our short lecture here. Please progress to the next step in the class.